Hey folks, this is Kalani. It's been a busy week in World of Warcraft. There are a whole bunch of class changes, buffs and nerfs to go over. There are some extra chances to get free heroic raid loot from taking part in special events. The Timewalking event had a weird bug that messed with the rewards from the weekly quest, and there's a special trading post event going on with huge sales on previously obtainable items, and there's 5 vendors to shop from instead of the usual one. There's a lot to talk about, so let's break it all down in this week's WoW News video. Now before we jump in, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another video. Let's kick things off with this week's round of class changes because we have some pretty huge buffs and nerfs to go over. Frost Death Knights are coming in swinging with a 20% buff to obliterate damage, a 15% buff to frost strike damage. Rime now increases the damage of Howling Blast by 275% up from 225. Breath of Syndragosa damage will see a 10% buff, and then the new 4-set bonus has been updated as well. For Unholy Death Knights, Death Coil damage is up 15%. Apocalypse Ghoul damage is up 25%, Magus of the Dead will see a 15% buff, Soul Reaper will see a 35% damage buff, and Clawing Shadows and Scourge Strike damage will both see a 15% damage increase. So both Death Knight DPS specs are getting some pretty significant buffs this week. Demon Hunters are up next, and both Immolation Aura and Sigil Flame damage have been increased by 6% for both specializations. Fellscarred will see a 40% buff to Demon Surge, so that's going to deal quite a bit more damage moving forward. Burning Blades was buffed up to 50% of listed ability damage over time, up from 35%, and Flamebound was buffed up to a 30% crit damage bonus. For Havoc specifically, their Mastery effectiveness has been increased by 25%, Soul Scar damage is reduced to 80% of your throw glaive, a Fire Inside will now cause Immolation Aura to deal chaos damage instead of fire, Cycle of Hatred stacks will persist until you've been out of combat for 60 seconds without casting Eye Beam, and there are a couple of bug fixes as well. Vengeance had a couple of nerfs tacked on at the bottom to watch out for. Burning Blood bonus to fire damage was reduced to 8% down from 10%, and Fiery Demise bonus damage was reduced to 15 and 30% down from 20 and 40%. Moving on to the Druids, Balance has some sizable buffs to specific talents and abilities. Power of Galdrin will see a huge 100% increase to its damage, Star Surge damage will be getting a 5% buff, and Touch of the Cosmos was buffed up to an 18% chance for Wrath and a 25% chance for Starfire. Feral hasn't been left out this week, they're going to see an 8% buff across the board for all of their abilities, which is always nice to see. Hunters made the list this week, and it's all buffs by the looks of things. For Beast Mastery, Bestial Wrath damage bonus was increased to 30% up from 25%, Kill Command damage will see a 10% buff, and then the new set bonuses have been updated as well. For Marksmanship, Aimed Shot is up 5%, Spotter's Mark damage bonus was increased to 20% up from 10%, and Windrunner Quiver's Precise Shots was updated to 90% from 80%. Mages have a few quick changes this week as well. For the Frostfire hero talent tree, Excess Fire can now stack up to 2 times, and the cooldown reduction of Excess Frost was reduced down to 3 seconds from 5 seconds. For Arcane Barrage damage is getting a 10% buff, and then Frostfire will see quite a few nerfs for both Fire and Frost specializations. The Monks are up next, and Brewmasters have finally seen some changes. It's not a lot, I'm afraid, just 2 buffs to Invoke Nizao to increase the Stagger Absorb and increase the Stomp damage, but I guess it's still better than nothing. Mistweaver's Jade Empowerment single target damage was reduced, but its cleave potential was increased, and then there are some updates to the new tier set bonuses as well. Holy Paladins have a handful of changes to go over this week. Word of Glory healing has been increased by 15%, Hammer and Anvil healing is being decreased by 33%, and then Light of Dawn healing will see a 12% buff as well. So some give and take for Holy Paladins this week. Then we come to the Rogues, and Outlaw is going to see a few buffs. Roll the Bones base chance to roll a 5 buff was doubled to 2% up from 1%, which is actually pretty huge, even though the numbers look so small. Sleight of Hand now grants a 20% increased chance of granting additional matches up from 16%, and then the new 4-set bonus grants a 40% chance of granting additional matches up from 16%, so your buff rolling is going to change quite a lot in the new patch. And then we're going to round out this week's changes with a whole bunch of buffs for Warrior. For Arms, Mortal Strike, Overpower and Dreadnought damage are up 20%, Cleave and Execute damage are up 10%, Slam damage is up 30%, and Colossus Smash and Warbreaker have some new visuals. For Fury, Rampage, Raging Blow, Crushing Blow, Bloodthirst and Bloodbath damage are all being increased by 20%, with Odin's Fury getting a 15% buff too, so both DPS Warrior specs are getting some huge buffs this week. Protection has some updates as well. Barbaric Training no longer increases the rage cost of Revenge, Execute damage will see a 10% buff, Frothing Berserker chance to refund rage was doubled up to 50%, and then their new tier set bonuses have been updated as well. That's all of the class changes that we have to go over this week, but with patch 11.1 rapidly approaching, I imagine we'll start to see more and more class changes each week. Now, all of these changes are a part of patch 11.1, which should go live sometimes towards the end of February, and the patch includes some huge class changes overall, with a few total reworks thrown in for good measure. So if you haven't gone over the entire list of class changes just yet, I'll give you a link to the PTR notes in the description so you can take a peek whenever you have a spare moment. Now, in other news, the Plunderstorm event was just updated to provide you with a free piece of heroic raid loot. If you earn 5,000 plunder in the Plunderstorm event, you should find a storm-singed plunder box in your in-game mailbox. Opening that box will grant you 2 keg legs bronze spoils and 1 keg leg silver spoils. Now, if you've been playing Plunderstorm already and you have already passed that 5,000 plunder requirement, you should have these items in your mailbox already, even if you don't play any more Plunderstorm. If you haven't jumped into Plunderstorm this time around, earning 5,000 plunder should be very fast. You can get that much in a couple of games. It's pretty easy to get at least 1,000 plunder per game, even if you're actively avoiding every other player. If you still haven't received your in-game mail, it may be worth popping back into Plunderstorm and farming a bit more plunder to see if that helps. The mail might also have been sent to one of your alts, so be sure to check all of your characters if you still can't find it. Now, there do seem to be some problems with players not receiving this mail at all yet, so I guess the bug that was supposed to be fixed hasn't been entirely fixed yet, so fingers crossed they get around to that ASAP. Now, the bronze spoils are kinda worthless, but the silver spoils can be handed in for a piece of heroic raid loot at the Kegleg vendor in Dornegal, who can be found aroundabouts here on your map. So that's one more piece of heroic raid loot to add to your collection from the Timewalking weekly quests. Sadly, this does seem to be 1 box per account, so that's just 1 piece of heroic raid gear across all of your characters, so you're going to have to really narrow down which character you need that extra piece of gear on. While we're on the topic of free heroic raid gear, there was an interesting bug this week with the Timewalking weekly quest rewards. Instead of showing a random box of loot like it usually does, the quests were showing exact item rewards. So you could see exactly what piece of gear you would be getting from the raid if you completed the Timewalking weekly quest. This created quite a stir, and folks figured out that the item would actually sometimes change if you swapped specs and logged out, even if your specializations have the same role. Here's some screenshots from a friend of a guildie with 2 different rewards for Arms and Fury on their warrior, so this could give you a couple of chances to roll the dice to see what item you could land on and then acquire if you completed the quest. Now, sadly, this was probably an unintended bug, as it was quite quickly reverted to the bog standard random box of loot, but this oddity does raise a few questions. To start with, is this how the random box of loot actually works under the hood? Is the item kind of locked in for our character and generated before we even get the reward and we just don't get to see it? That could also mean that the reward may change if you swap specs, which I guess doesn't really matter all that much without being able to see the item change, but you could be changing your outcome depending on the specialization you are whenever you hand that quest in. It's a bit weird to think about, and it does make you wonder when some folks end up with 4 cloaks in a row from these kinds of random rewards sometimes. Maybe something to do with the random generating part of these kinds of rewards actually doesn't work properly, but we're getting a bit tinfoily here. This does beg another question though. Would being able to see these rewards be better than the random box? Suddenly being able to see what items you can expect from taking part in the Timewalking weekly event created a lot of excitement. Guildies were comparing items and rewards, people were racing to get their dungeons done to secure that item, and then for the players with some of the poorer rewards that they weren't that interested in, they were still excited that they then didn't have to waste their time anymore. If it's not an item you need, not having to do the 5 Timewalking dungeons felt better than rolling the dice. So I'm actually really curious to see what you think about this potential bug. Should this be how Timewalking rewards are displayed? Would you prefer to see the item you'd get at the end of your Timewalking dungeons, even if that meant seeing an item that wouldn't necessarily be worth your time? Let me know what you think about this in the comments section below. And then we also have a special trading post event this month. It's the 2nd anniversary of the trading post system going live, so the traveler's log is a little longer and we are to pick up an extra 500 traders tender, which is going to be very nice because we have the most trading post options we've ever had this month, and there's a whole bunch of stuff on sale. So the normal trading post options are very Love is in the Air themed. There's a really cool Silver Moon broom mount, perfect for all you Blood Elf mains out there. There's a bunch of Mists of Pandaria themed weapons and various other bits and bobs. A lot of older Valentine style rewards have also been brought back, so be sure you check out the trading post if you like this kind of thing. But the crazy thing this month is that we have 4 other special vendors that have a lot of older reward options, and they are all much cheaper than they originally were. These vendors can be found a little down the road from the usual vendors in Dornegal, right by the staircase that leads up to the flight path. There's one for armor transmogs and ensembles with plenty of hats, cloaks, transmogs, dresses, and pretty much everything else that you wear as an armor piece. There's one with a whole bunch of weapons, which includes 2-handers, 1-handers, offhands, and shields, so if you missed a special weapon in the past, it may be on this vendor right now. Another vendor has a bunch of mounts, pets, and toys from previous months, and again, these are quite a bit cheaper when compared to their original price. You can actually see the original price of everything too, so you can see how much cheaper each item is, and with mounts being some of the most expensive items in the trading post, saving 300 or 400 traders tender per mount you buy is actually huge, so your tender will go much further if you focus on these special vendors during this month. And then the last one has rewards that were previously obtained from completing the Traveler's Log, things like the Cosmic Weapons, the Ashadal mount, and the Darkmoon Harlequin Ensemble. So if you missed one of these cool sets or mount rewards because you weren't playing during that month, you can pick those up as well. So if you haven't been consistently playing over the last 2 years, I would totally check out these vendors to see if there's anything interesting that you might want to pick up. It's kinda like we have 5 trading post vendors this month instead of the typical 1. We don't have a solid time frame on how long these vendors will stick around, but I assume they will stay for the month of February and will be back to normal for the month of March, so just keep that in mind. But that's all of the WoW news we have for this week, so that's it for this video. What do you think of all those trading post items coming back and being available for much cheaper? And how do you feel about the Timewalking reward bug? Would you prefer random box rewards to show you the exact item that you get, or does that take out some of the fun of the whole thing? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon and to all of our members here on YouTube. You can see the names floating by on screen. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can find links in the description or click the join button just below the video. If you enjoyed the video or found it useful in any way, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you're always kept up to date. Thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.